In a world where trade deals shape economies and international relationships are more fragile than ever, one industry is finding itself in the crossfire: agriculture. The ongoing trade war between the United States and China is no longer just about tariffs or high-tech industries, it's about the food we eat, the crops we grow, and the livelihoods of millions of farmers. So, what happens when the world's two largest economies clash over something as basic as food? From soybeans to pork, and cotton to corn, the ripple effects are undeniable, and the stakes have never been higher. Tonight, we explore how this trade war has moved beyond boardrooms and negotiations and is now affecting the very heart of rural America. Farmers, once thriving from exports to China, are now struggling with reduced demand and skyrocketing uncertainty. With global food markets hanging in the balance, it's a crisis that goes far beyond borders and affects us all. It all started in 2018, when the United States, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, initiated a trade war with China, one of the world's most powerful economies. The goal was clear: to rebalance trade relations, protect American industries, and reduce the U.S. trade deficit, which at the time stood at over $400 billion with China alone. But what began as a few targeted tariffs quickly escalated into a high-stakes battle that would ripple through economies around the globe. Initially, the U.S. targeted Chinese goods with tariffs on electronics, machinery, and consumer goods. But soon, agriculture, a sector that had long been a cornerstone of U.S.-China trade, became one of the fiercest battlegrounds. In response to U.S. tariffs, China retaliated by imposing its own tariffs on a wide range of American products, including soybeans, pork, cotton, and sorghum. Soybeans, a key agricultural export, became one of the most heavily targeted commodities in this trade war. For years, China had been the largest importer of U.S. soybeans, purchasing nearly one-third of all American soybean exports. But with China's new tariffs in place, this vital trade relationship started to unravel. As tariffs began to bite, China sought to reduce its dependence on American soybeans. They turned to Brazil, Argentina, and other countries, who quickly filled the gap left by the U.S. But for American farmers, the situation was dire. Soybean prices plummeted, and with it, the income of thousands of farmers who had relied heavily on the Chinese market for their livelihood. By mid-2019, U.S. soybean exports to China had fallen by over 20%, amounting to a loss of nearly $3 billion in export revenue. For many farmers in states like Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska, the drop in demand was crippling. Fields that once flourished with soybeans stood empty, while farmers scrambled to find new buyers, often at lower prices, and faced the heartbreaking decision of whether they could continue. In addition to soybeans, other products like pork, cotton, and sorghum were hit with tariffs, further straining U.S. farmers. Pork producers were especially hard hit as China is the largest consumer of pork in the world, and the tariffs made American pork too expensive for Chinese buyers. Cotton, another vital crop, saw its export numbers to China drop by 25%, as China turned to other suppliers. China's retaliatory tariffs were part of a broader strategy to push back against U.S. pressure, but the consequences for American agriculture were severe. As trade negotiations continued, the Trump administration attempted to alleviate some of the damage by offering subsidies to struggling farmers. But for many, these payments were a temporary solution to a far deeper problem: the long-term loss of a key market. Even as negotiations persisted, the damage to American farmers had already been done. While the U.S. and China entered into partial agreements in 2020, with China agreeing to purchase more U.S. agricultural goods, the uncertainty still looms large. For many farmers, the trade war has left lasting scars, and they are now facing a completely transformed global market. The Phase 1 trade deal in early 2020 brought temporary relief, as China promised to increase purchases of U.S. agricultural goods. However, with the continued fluctuations in tariffs and the unpredictability of global trade dynamics, many American farmers are still uncertain about what lies ahead. The U.S.-China trade war has altered the landscape of global agriculture, and its effects are still being felt today. As the U.S.-China trade war unfolded, the most direct and devastating impact was felt by the farmers across America's heartland. For generations, American farmers have fed not just the U.S., but the world, with millions of tons of grains, meats, and fibers exported globally. But with the trade war, particularly the tariffs on agricultural exports, these farmers found themselves at a crossroads, facing a combination of financial hardship, market uncertainty, and emotional strain. One of the hardest hit groups has been the soybean farmers. Before the trade war, China accounted for about 30% of all U.S. soybean exports. This market wasn't just large, it was vital. In some states, particularly in the Midwest, farmers grew soybeans almost exclusively for export to China. But as China imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. soybeans, the demand for American crops in their largest market evaporated. By the summer of 2019, the financial consequences were clear. Soybean prices had dropped significantly, falling by as much as 20%. The ripple effect on farmers' income was staggering. In states like Iowa, Indiana, and Illinois, soybean farmers found themselves facing mounting debt, crop spoilage, and in some cases, the heartbreaking decision to leave the industry altogether. Without the revenue from Chinese exports, many farmers were forced to rethink their entire farming strategy. But the damage wasn't limited to soybeans. Pork producers were also hit hard. China is the world's largest consumer of pork, and the US is a major exporter of this essential product. But when tariffs were placed on US pork, it made American meat too expensive for Chinese buyers. As a result, US pork exports to China plummeted by more than 30% in just 1 year. For many pork producers, this loss of trade with China meant they were left scrambling for alternative markets, and with limited options, their profit margins shrank dramatically. The closure of export markets meant that farms that had once operated at full capacity were now sitting with overstocked inventories of meat that could no longer be sold at a profitable price. The trade war also dealt a severe blow to cotton farmers. Cotton, a crucial crop for the US, has long been a significant export to China. In fact, China used to be the #1 importer of American cotton. But with tariffs in place, Chinese demand for US cotton dropped by nearly 25%, leaving farmers who had invested heavily in this crop with dwindling markets. The result was a further decline in cotton prices, and the continued financial strain on an already burdened sector. Farmers across the country weren't just dealing with the economic fallout from these losses, they also had to face the emotional toll. Farming is not just a job, it's a way of life, passed down through generations. For many, it's a tradition that runs deep in their families. So when the trade war began to erode their ability to make a living, it wasn't just their bank accounts that were affected, it was their sense of purpose, their communities, and their futures. In response, the US government introduced a series of relief programs to help offset the damage. These programs, including direct payments to farmers and government-backed purchasing of excess crops, were intended to help farmers survive the immediate impact of the trade war. But for many, these payments weren't enough to make up for lost exports. The pain of losing an essential market wasn't something that a check could heal. By late 2020, as the US and China reached a Phase 1 trade deal, there were hopes that the worst was over. Under the deal, China agreed to purchase more US agricultural goods, including soybeans, pork, and cotton. But even as the deal was signed, the scars on American agriculture remained. Prices had not fully recovered, and many farmers continued to face uncertainty as the trade war raged on. Despite the trade deal, many questions remain. Would China follow through on its promises? And, perhaps more importantly, could US farmers ever fully recover from the damage done? The effects of the trade war on American farmers are not something that can be undone quickly, and while some have found new markets or adjusted their crops, the long-term impact on their livelihoods, and their communities, remains uncertain. As the trade war dragged on, China faced a dilemma: how to secure its vast demand for agricultural products without relying on the United States. With tariffs on US goods continuing to rise, China had no choice but to diversify its sources of supply. And the country quickly turned its gaze to other nations, especially Brazil, which would emerge as the key beneficiary of the trade war. Brazil, once a secondary player in global agricultural markets, began to surge ahead. Its vast farmlands, already capable of producing soybeans, cotton, and other crops, were now able to meet China's demand for these key products. In fact, by 2020, Brazil's soybean exports to China had surpassed those of the US, marking a dramatic shift in global trade patterns. Brazil's expansion into China's agricultural market wasn't just about filling a gap, it was about filling a void left by the US tariffs. With no immediate end in sight to the trade war, China began to invest more heavily in Brazilian agriculture, cementing its place as China's top supplier of soybeans. By 2025, Brazil would dominate more than 75% of China's soybean imports, a far cry from the 30% it had just a few years earlier. This shift has had a profound impact not just on Brazil's agricultural economy, but on global trade as a whole. With China leaning more heavily on Brazil, the entire balance of the soybean market has tilted dramatically. This has sparked a wave of new investment into Brazil's infrastructure, more roads, better ports, and expanded storage facilities to handle the increasing demand. But Brazil isn't the only country benefiting from this shift. Argentina, another major agricultural exporter, has also seen a spike in demand for its products. With China diversifying its sources, Argentina was able to step in and pick up some of the slack in the cotton and soybean markets. Other countries, like Russia and India, have also seen opportunities to increase their agricultural exports to China, as Beijing looks for alternatives to US goods. For China, this new strategy of sourcing agricultural goods from multiple countries offers several advantages. First, it reduces the country's dependency on any single source, ensuring that trade disruptions, like those caused by the US tariffs, won't severely impact its food supply. Second, it opens the door for China to negotiate better trade deals with a variety of countries, thus strengthening its position in global trade. China's move to diversify its agricultural imports is a clear strategy to safeguard its food security. By spreading its supply chain across multiple countries, China is not only hedging against the risks of future trade conflicts, but also strengthening its position in global trade negotiations. However, this shift isn't without challenges. As Chinese demand for Brazilian soybeans and Argentine pork grows, the pressure on these countries to maintain consistent production and quality will increase. Brazil, despite its newfound dominance in the Chinese market, faces challenges of its own. Environmental concerns, such as deforestation in the Amazon, have led to growing scrutiny of Brazilian agriculture. As China's demand continues to rise, Brazil will have to balance increased production with sustainable practices, a task that won't be easy as international pressure on environmental standards grows. Despite these challenges, Brazil's agricultural sector is poised to continue its dominance. As the U.S. struggles to regain its footing in the Chinese market, Brazil and other emerging suppliers are stepping up to meet China's growing needs. For American farmers, this means fierce competition, with fewer opportunities to regain market share in a world that is becoming increasingly divided by trade politics. China's pivot away from U.S. agricultural imports is not just a product of tariffs, it's a fundamental shift in the global agricultural trade system. The repercussions of the U.S.-China trade war extend far beyond the borders of the two countries involved. While the trade dispute initially seemed to be a bilateral issue, its ripple effects have been felt across the globe, transforming agricultural markets and shaking up economies that rely heavily on international trade. The shift in trade patterns triggered by the conflict between the world's two largest economies has led to a complete restructuring of the global agricultural landscape. As China diversified its agricultural imports, countries like Brazil, Argentina, and even Russia seized the opportunity to fill the void left by the U.S. In many cases, these countries ramped up production to meet China's growing demands, while also gaining a competitive edge in global markets. For instance, Brazil, with its vast soybean fields, quickly became China's top supplier, displacing the U.S. as the world's leading exporter of soybeans. But the shift didn't stop there. Argentina, a major supplier of soybeans and pork, also saw its exports to China surge. Pork, in particular, was a key beneficiary, as Chinese demand skyrocketed due to the African swine fever crisis, which devastated China's domestic pig population. In the wake of this crisis, Argentina stepped in to provide pork to the Chinese market, gaining a strong foothold. Meanwhile, Russia also took advantage of the shifting trade patterns, increasing its exports of wheat and barley to China and other global markets. For these countries, the opening of new markets in China was a welcome boost, helping to stabilize their economies and drive economic growth. But while emerging suppliers like Brazil and Argentina saw clear benefits, the impact on global agricultural trade was not all positive. The reshuffling of trade routes and supply chains has caused disruptions and volatility in other parts of the world. As new players enter the global agricultural market, the competition for limited resources has intensified. For countries that relied on the U.S. as their primary source of agricultural goods, the trade war has left a void. Nations in Africa and Europe that traditionally imported American soybeans, corn, and other crops have had to turn to new suppliers, often at higher prices. The increased competition and rising costs have put pressure on food prices globally, affecting both consumers and industries alike. In addition, the shift in trade flows has created a scenario where countries with weaker economies or less developed agricultural sectors are now forced to compete for the same markets. This has resulted in both opportunities and risks. Countries in Africa, for instance, are seeing a rise in demand for their agricultural exports, but at the same time, they lack the infrastructure and resources to meet the growing need efficiently. While some African nations are gaining new trade opportunities, they are also facing challenges in scaling up production to meet global demand. The need for better agricultural technology, improved infrastructure, and enhanced trade agreements has never been more urgent. Without these developments, countries in the developing world could find themselves locked out of lucrative markets, unable to keep up with the demand for their products. Meanwhile, European nations have been working to expand their agricultural exports to China, but with mixed results. While some countries have managed to capitalize on the opportunity, others have faced obstacles due to trade barriers and competition from other suppliers. The European Union, for example, has increased its exports of dairy products, wine, and other agricultural goods, but the shift in demand has led to increased price sensitivity among consumers. Beyond the immediate economic effects, the trade war has also contributed to a broader shift in how countries view agricultural security. For many nations, the global food supply chain is now seen as more vulnerable than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic only highlighted these vulnerabilities, with disruptions in global trade and supply chains affecting food production and distribution. The trade war between the U.S. and China has made clear that food security is no longer just a national issue, it's a global one. As countries continue to adjust to the new realities of global trade, the U.S.-China trade war has shown just how interconnected the world's agricultural systems are. While the U.S. and China were the central players, the impact of their dispute has reverberated around the globe, influencing agricultural policies, market trends, and food security in ways no one could have predicted. In the years to come, the lessons learned from this trade conflict will shape how countries approach food production, trade, and agricultural policy. The world is waking up to the fact that food security and agricultural trade are as much a matter of international diplomacy as they are of farming practices. The shifting tides of global agricultural trade are not just changing who grows our food, they are changing who controls it. Behind the economic statistics and trade agreements, the true cost of the U.S.-China trade war is measured in the lives of the farmers who are the backbone of America's agricultural industry. For these men and women, farming is not just a job, it's a way of life, a tradition passed down through generations. Yet, as tariffs cripple their markets and crops, these same farmers are finding themselves on the brink of financial ruin. For years, American farmers built their businesses around the certainty of international trade, especially with China. The lucrative export markets for crops like soybeans, corn, and pork were a lifeline. But when the trade war hit, this stability was shattered, leaving farmers without the income they relied on. Many were suddenly forced to look at their fields not with pride, but with growing concern over how to pay the bills and make ends meet. Many farmers, particularly those in the Midwest, face a heartbreaking reality: the crops they've spent years cultivating now sit unused, unsold, and unwanted. With the Chinese market no longer available to absorb their harvest, many have seen the value of their crops plummet. And when the harvest doesn't bring in enough income, the bills pile up. For some, this leads to hard decisions, whether to hold on or to sell the farm that has been in the family for generations. In the past few years, the trade war has driven many farmers to consider selling their land, while others are forced to take on loans they can't afford. According to recent reports, more than 7,000 U.S. farms were lost in 2020 alone, a sharp increase from previous years. For farmers who have dedicated their entire lives to this work, watching the land they love being sold to the highest bidder is a painful and often devastating choice. Perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of this crisis is the emotional toll it's taking on farmers. Farming isn't just about profits, it's about pride. It's about the land that generations of families have worked to cultivate. When the promise of that livelihood evaporates due to a trade war, it can have deep psychological and emotional consequences. Many farmers have reported feelings of depression, anxiety, and a sense of isolation. Farming, by its nature, is already one of the most high-pressure professions, requiring long hours, immense physical labor, and a constant battle with nature's unpredictability. Add to that the uncertainty of trade deals and the collapse of international markets, and the pressure becomes nearly unbearable. Support systems, both local and national, have risen to try and help these farmers in their darkest moments. Local farm advocacy groups have stepped in, offering financial assistance, mental health resources, and counseling services. The government, too, introduced aid programs to help cushion the blow of lost exports. However, these efforts, while crucial, have not been enough to offset the lasting damage done. Despite the efforts to offer assistance, the psychological scars remain. The looming threat of losing their farms, coupled with the loss of their main income source, continues to weigh heavily on American farmers. Even when government relief payments come in, they are often seen as a temporary fix to a much deeper issue, an issue that goes beyond the numbers of trade tariffs and market prices. For many farmers, the trade war isn't just an economic hardship, it's a personal crisis. It's the loss of a lifestyle, the end of a family legacy, and the disintegration of a dream that has been built over decades. And while some may adapt and find new markets or new crops, many will never recover from the devastating effects of this conflict. As the US-China trade war rages on, American farmers remain on the front lines, bearing the brunt of this conflict. Their struggles are a stark reminder that trade wars aren't just about tariffs and market shares, they're about real people, their livelihoods. As the US-China trade war enters its next phase, American farmers find themselves at a crossroads. With the trade dispute still unresolved and global markets shifting, the question remains, what comes next for those who have been caught in the crossfire? Can the damage be undone, or will these farmers be left to navigate an uncertain future alone? Despite the struggles, there are signs of hope on the horizon. With the new administration in Washington, there have been renewed efforts to engage in trade talks with China, aiming to restore some of the lost agricultural trade. President Biden's team has signaled that they are open to negotiations, and some progress has been made in reopening certain trade channels. But this time, the approach is different. Farmers and agricultural leaders are pushing for long-term solutions that go beyond temporary relief and focus on building a more resilient and stable agricultural system. Part of the solution lies in a more diversified approach to global trade. While China remains an important partner, U.S. farmers are now looking to build relationships with other nations. Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia have emerged as growing markets for U.S. agricultural exports. For example, the European Union has shown interest in increasing imports of American meat, dairy, and grains, which offers new opportunities for farmers who've seen their Chinese markets evaporate. However, this diversification isn't an easy fix. These new markets come with their own set of challenges, including varying regulations, fluctuating demand, and competition from other global suppliers. Still, for many, these new opportunities represent a lifeline, allowing them to hedge against the risks of relying too heavily on any one market, especially China. But it's not just about diversifying markets, it's about strengthening the agricultural sector from within. Experts argue that the key to a more resilient future for U.S. farmers lies in increasing investment in agricultural technology and sustainability. Precision farming, which uses data and technology to optimize crop yields and reduce waste, is one example of how U.S. farmers are adapting to new economic realities. By embracing innovation, farmers can reduce their reliance on traditional farming methods and position themselves for success in an increasingly tech-driven world. Whether it's improving water efficiency, adopting more sustainable practices, or utilizing artificial intelligence to predict crop yields, technology holds the promise of a more efficient, profitable, and environmentally friendly future. Another key part of the solution is addressing the mental health crisis among farmers. With the increasing pressure of trade disruptions, unpredictable weather patterns, and the financial strain of the past few years, many farmers are feeling isolated and stressed. Support programs that offer counseling, stress relief, and community building initiatives are becoming essential as part of the recovery process. These mental health programs are vital because they offer more than just a temporary fix, they offer hope. For many farmers, knowing they have access to resources that address their well-being is just as important as financial aid or market access. The toll that stress and anxiety take on farmers' health cannot be overstated, and providing long-term support systems is crucial for ensuring their ability to persevere in the face of adversity. Looking ahead, there is a growing realization that agriculture must evolve in response to the challenges of the 21st century. The world is changing, and the way we produce food must adapt to global demands, technological advancements, and environmental pressures. While the trade war between the US and China has caused immense hardship, it has also prompted the agricultural community to think differently about the future. The road to recovery for American farmers will not be quick or easy. It will require the collaboration of governments, the private sector, and the farmers themselves. But if the lessons learned from this trade war are taken to heart, it could lead to a more resilient and diversified agricultural system, one that is better equipped to handle future disruptions. For now, the road ahead remains uncertain. But one thing is clear, American farmers have shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. They will continue to fight for their livelihoods and for the future of agriculture, no matter what challenges lie ahead. And as they navigate this new landscape, they will continue to feed the world, just as they always have. As we've seen, the challenges faced by American farmers due to the US-China trade war have been immense. From financial hardship to emotional strain, the effects have been felt deeply in the heart of rural America. But even in the face of adversity, these farmers have shown incredible strength and resilience. They continue to adapt, innovate, and persevere, all while feeding the world. The road to recovery may be long, but with determination, collaboration, and support from all corners of society, there is hope for a brighter future. It's a future where American agriculture not only survives but thrives, adapting to the new realities of global trade, technology, and sustainability. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the struggles and triumphs of American farmers. Stay tuned, as the story of resilience in agriculture continues to unfold. This is just the beginning of a new chapter.